Cinco de Mayo is not Mexico's biggest holiday. It isn't even close. And it isn't their Independence Day either. Mexico does have one of those on a completely different date, commemorating a completely different event from a completely different century, and most Americans have never even heard of it. But today, the 5th of May, is just a regular Tuesday outside of one Mexican state, with the banks open, the schools running, and the lady selling tamales on my corner working like she does every other day. Now, if that surprises you, if you genuinely believe that today was Mexico's 4th of July, hang around for a second, because the version of Mexico in your head was built by people who weren't trying to help you learn how to live here. These are three of the most common myths that I come across with our consulting clients, things that Americans have learned about Mexico over time that just aren't correct. Now, I'm telling you these things as someone who actually lives here. So, the story starts in 1861, when Mexico was effectively bankrupt. President Benito Juarez had just suspended payments on the country's foreign debts, and within months, Britain, Spain, and France all sent warships to Veracruz to collect what they believed they were owed. Britain and Spain, though, negotiated. They took what they could get and they went home. But France stayed, and the reason why France stayed had nothing to do with money particularly. It was because Napoleon III didn't want to just be paid. He wanted an empire in the Americas, and this was a perfect excuse. So, the French army began marching inland toward Mexico City. And at that point in history, they were considered the strongest military force in the world. They reached the city of Puebla on May 5th, 1862, where roughly 4,000 poorly equipped Mexican soldiers under General Ignacio Zaragoza had dug in at two hilltop forts overlooking the city. Now, there were roughly 6,000 French troops under General Charles de Lorenz, and they attacked. There were 3 frontal assaults, and there were 3 failures. By the end of the day, the French had lost about 10 times the men the Mexicans had, and they retreated in disarray. That's the Battle of Puebla. That's what we're celebrating on Cinco de Mayo. And here's the part that nobody tells you. This was actually just a symbolic victory, not a strategic one. France came back the next year with 30,000 more troops and took the country anyway, installing an Austrian archduke named Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. Now, here's a line that should make every American sit up straight. Mexico's actual Independence Day, the one I mentioned at the top, is September 16th, and it commemorates the Grito de Dolores in 1810, when Father Miguel Hidalgo issued a call to revolt against Spain. That's 52 years before the Battle of Puebla. Cinco de Mayo doesn't commemorate Mexican independence. It's not even commemorated in the same century. The closest cultural reference for Americans is probably the Battle of the Alamo, a regional battle that everyone has heard of and is observed every year in Texas, but never was elevated to a federal holiday and was never claimed by the rest of the country as a national holiday. Now, Cinco de Mayo is the Mexican version of that, a symbolic regional military victory, not a national birthday. Except somehow Americans have turned the holiday into a bigger version of that than the Mexicans have, and they weren't even involved in the proceedings. Which raises the obvious question, why does the United States version of Cinco de Mayo dwarf the Mexican one? There are 2 reasons, and neither one of them have really anything to do with Mexico. Within Mexico itself, Cinco de Mayo is a state holiday only in Puebla, where the battle actually happened, and it's also a full holiday in the neighboring state of Veracruz. That's it. Outside of those 2 states, it isn't a federal holiday at all. In Puebla itself, you'll see military parades and battle reenactments, guys dressed in 1862 French and Mexican uniforms charging up the same hill where the actual battle happened. There will be speeches at the actual fort and mole poblano on every table. It is a solemn regional celebration that is grounded in pride for a specific or historical moment. But across the rest of the country, like where I live in Jalisco, nobody is particularly doing anything special. The convenience store down the street is open, the gym is open, and nobody anywhere is wearing a sombrero to celebrate. The most common reaction to foreigners asking about it is mild amusement. So to find out how Cinco de Mayo became such a big deal in the United States, let's take a look at California back in 1862 and 1863. There were a lot of Mexican-American miners in California, and they were the ones who initially celebrated the news from Puebla. Now, they were Union supporters during the American Civil War, and they saw the Mexican victory over a European empire as part of the same fight against autocracy and empire. But what it became, though, is something else entirely. Fast forward to the 1980s, and the beer companies got a hold of it. Corona, Modelo, Budweiser, and they turned it into a marketing event. Today, Cinco de Mayo in the United States generates beer sales on par with the Super Bowl. And in 2005, the US Congress officially recognized a Mexican holiday that the Mexican federal government never has. So here's where we are right now. Bigger parades happen in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston than anywhere in Mexico outside of the city of Puebla. More money is spent, more margaritas consumed, more tacos sold, all in the United States, the country that was not invaded by a country and a country that did not participate in the battle. That was myth number one. That's the easy myth on our list today. This brings us to item number 2 on our misconceptions about Mexico lists. The blogs will tell you Mexico is dramatically cheaper than the US. And in the abstract, that is true. But what they don't factor in is something called lifestyle inflation. You will not, on day one, start living like a Mexican middle-class family. You'll want an apartment that looks like the one you left at home. You want to go to the grocery store and stock the things that you recognize. You'll want a gym, trips to the coffee shop, a neighborhood that feels familiar with amenities and location. And all of that costs more, even in Mexico. Sometimes a lot more than the average Mexican family's lifestyle. And that lifestyle that the average Mexican family lives is the one that the blogs are using to calculate their numbers to make things look a whole lot cheaper than they actually are. Take my own situation as an example. I pay $1,500 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in a luxury apartment complex, which is the same amount of money that I paid in Indianapolis for a one-bedroom apartment. Now, it's a bigger apartment, more space, but it's the same exact amount of money. I do save money on things like the cost of food, doctor appointments, and consumables like that. So there are some real savings, but they're not across the board the way that the blogs make you feel like they are. The people who get this wrong are the ones who run out of runway in a year or two and end up on a flight home defeated, telling everybody that Mexico was a scam. Mexico wasn't a scam. The math was just bad. The best way to get a handle on what the actual difference in costs are is to spend time on the ground before you commit. And I'll give you the full breakdown at length on that in its own video coming soon. So tell me in the comments, what stories, good or bad, have you heard about Mexico? What else have you been told about life abroad that you suspect now might not be quite accurate? Drop it in the comments and help us set the record straight in future videos. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss when those deep dives drop on this channel. And that brings us to number 3 for Mexico, crime. Here's the thing that nobody's willing to say plainly. Mexico certainly isn't perfect, but no country is, including the United States. And yet somehow when an American thinks about moving to Mexico, the image in their head is that there's a single national crime scene. So let me flip it for you with an analogy. Imagine a European who has never been to the United States, and the only thing that they have ever seen is the news covering Miami at its worst. Drug violence, shootings, organized crime running the streets. Would that European have an accurate picture of what it's like to live in Indianapolis, in Seattle? Of course not. They'd be insane to base their major life decisions on a picture that is so limited. But that's exactly how people picture Mexico when they consider moving it there right now. The reality here is that crime is localized and organized. It does not spill into the streets where expats actually live the way that the American news coverage implies that it does, or the way that your favorite Netflix show makes it seem like it's happening every day. There are cities in Mexico right now that you've been told to avoid that actually have lower violent crime rates than major metropolitan US cities. Now that's going to be part of our upcoming breakdown as well. We're going to do a deep dive across the board, showing you exactly which Mexican cities correspond with certain American cities so you can get a better idea of exactly what the lifestyle is like from a less biased standpoint. Now, and then of course there's those State Department travel advisories that people tend to read. Those aren't crime maps. Those are risk management documents written for a completely different purpose, but people treat them as gospel. I would say that firsthand, trusted intelligence is the only thing that cuts through that kind of noise. Every assumption you have about life in Mexico was built by someone trying to sell you something. Beer, airtime, a new show on your streaming service, or just fear. They never actually wanted to help you move abroad, and that's why you need to consider the source when you're considering whether or not you want to move somewhere. Which leads us to the next question. How do you fix this? Well, let me tell you this. It's not from a Google search. It's not from a YouTube binge. Even this one. The only thing that actually fixes it for you in the specific way that you want to live and the concerns that you have is time on the ground before you commit. And that's exactly what digital nomad visas exist for. You live somewhere for 6, 12, or 18 months on a flexible visa that doesn't lock you in. And during that time, you find out what is actually true. You learn about real costs. You walk the neighborhoods, you meet the people, and then you decide whether to pull the trigger on making a residency permanent or whether to try another country on your list. Now, the hardest part of being a digital nomad is figuring out which countries even offer digital nomad visas, what the requirements to apply for one are, and which one fits your situation the best. That's why we built the world's largest digital nomad visa guide. 68 countries cataloged and arranged so you can actually compare your options side by side, both on how to qualify and how to arrange your life once you get there. Mexico is in it, of course, and it is what we consider to be the strongest option of the entire group worldwide that is available to people today. The link for that is in the description. The best time to figure out what you didn't know was before you buy the plane ticket. The second best time is right now. The right information makes it all possible. I'm Brad with Evolution Expats, and I'll see you in our next video.